After listening to you and Colonel Douglas Macgregor, your colleague, I have been arguing, I didn't coin this phrase, it's a great phrase, that President Biden has us sleepwalking into World War III.
Right.
And lately I've been making a couple of points to support that, and I'd like you to share your views on it. The use of HIMARS in Ukraine, but actually triggered by American military in Poland. The comments by Victoria Nuland, she of the first Trump impeachment Ukraine scandal, now number 2 or 3 in the State Department, saying we want to liberate Crimea.
Yeah.
And the presence of 2 Ukrainian fighter pilots in the United States learning how to fly American F-16s. I mean, how dangerous is all this? We'll start with the HIMARS. I mean, I'm using these 3 events, which are inassailable. They're all historical events.
Right.
To argue that we are sleepwalking into World War III. Do you agree with the argument, and can you address these? We'll start with the HIMARS.
I do. Let's start with the HIMARS. So that system is beyond the capability of the Ukrainian military to run. They simply do not have the expertise, leadership, internal and technical skills to be able to organically maintain and run that. That is to say that someone else to help them. I'm pretty sure it's us, just saying. So one thing that I've not heard anybody say, and I'm going to say this on your show here, what happens if we have a Francis Gary Power situation? Remember, Francis Gary Power was the U-2 pilot that got shot down in 61, 60. He was what happens when a U.S. citizen wrapped up as a prisoner of the Russians? What does that do to us?
I mean, as you and I both know, you better than I from your career in the military, even though a lot of what you did, I don't think I'm spilling any beans, was undercover. But out of uniform, you know the risk you took. Out of uniform with no visible insignia, you lose the Geneva Convention protections. Macgregor informs that there are hundreds of American military out of uniform on the ground in Ukraine operating equipment like these HIMARS.
Right.
And there are American military in uniform in Poland pulling the trigger, so to speak, on the HIMARS. So if you ask the question, are American guys shooting at Russian guys? The answer is yes.
Right.
Can Russia shoot back under the law? The answer, sadly, is yes.
But I don't think they will. And that's where I agree with Doug as well. I think Doug says that the Russians have no interest in going to war with us. I think it's true. It doesn't mean that they won't grab someone and use them for leverage. Just saying. I think that the two both can be true. And this is where there may be some daylight between Doug and I. I do believe that Poland, we should be in Poland by the fact that Poland did suffer from the Soviet Union. They do have a legitimate, in their view, I'm saying from their perspective, not our perspective, fear of Russian expansion. With that said, the Polish people don't want the war. So I think this leads us back to the point of where, do we know what we're doing? And I think the answer is by us antagonizing and continuing to push and provide for more support where we are jeopardizing our interests by putting American citizens, whether they're military or not, whether they're undercover or not. When you do that, Judge, you prompt the potential for an expansion of the war. And one of the greatest dangers is miscalculation. So, and that miscalculation is being driven by Joe Biden, who has no idea of what they're doing. It's simply just throwing money and weapons into the fray and hoping for the best. And hoping is not a policy.
Talking about Poland.
Right.
The president of Poland has argued that the American military and the Polish military should be used to liberate Crimea.
Yeah, I don't know.
In my view, insane. The Victoria Nuland, she of the Ukraine Trump impeachment scandal, now number 2 or 3, I'm not sure which, in the State Department. In those days, she was in charge of Eastern Europe. She's number 2 or 3, right underneath Tony Blinken.
Right.
Said the other day, we should liberate Crimea. Now, liberate Crimea. Crimea has been Russian since Catherine the Great was the head of the government, and that was before George III was the king of Great Britain. So Crimea has been part of Russia since before the United States existed.
Right.
Is this the real goal of Tony Blinken, or is she an outlier? Is Nuland an outlier?
No, I think the neocons and neo-liberals want this. They want this for purposes of control and expansion of the nation state, and especially the EU. They want to make EU an expansionist state. I'm going to say something that's probably going to be in trouble. You know, a guy named Adolf Hitler wanted to expand his state for purposes of influence and growing room. That's the impression I have with what they want to do. They want "quote unquote" growing room. And just let me put this in context. Okay, you seize Crimea, and then what? Tony Zinni, one of my mentors from the old days, General Zinni was commander of Central Command. He basically told me the story of how President Clinton called him in 7 times when they had a dispute, because any number of times, Judge, Tony Zinni would be asked, can you do something militarily? Can you achieve military objectives? And he would go up and meet with the president face to face, and he would lay out how we could probably do it militarily. And he'd always ask the question, then what? What are you going to do after we achieve military objectives? So the same thing here. Okay, first off, you're going to be breaking the fundamental purpose of NATO. NATO is a defensive organization. I would argue that there should be a reinforcement of the fact that, Judge, it is a defensive organization. It is only there to defend when there's someone who goes on the offensive. That's it.
I want to stick with Poland, but I have to ask you this. When Gorbachev and George H.W. decided that the Berlin Wall would come down and Eastern Europe would be liberated, it was based on a promise that H.W. and Jim Baker made to President Gorbachev that NATO would never move eastward. And of course, we know what Clinton did. Clinton moved NATO eastward. I mean, can you imagine the Chinese having offensive weaponry at the Rio Grande aimed at Dallas? I mean, that's what Putin is confronting. Is there even, and at the time that happened, what else happened? The Warsaw Pact, which was the communist version of NATO, ceased to exist.
Right.
We need NATO for anymore without the Warsaw Pact.
Well, that's been a question for a long time. I've said publicly and did editorials that there's no purpose for it. As a matter of fact, it's a boys' club, literally. I mean, that's what you do. You got all these guys running around in uniform. Many of the European Union nations with long hair. Heck, a while back, I don't know if you remember, the EU wanted to have its own military. It's like, you've already got NATO. Why do you want a military with the EU?
I do remember that. Yes.
So my first question, why do you want a militarized Europe anyway? No offense to the Europeans. Anytime you militarize, you get in trouble. We have to come bail you out. We've done it like 3 times now. I don't think we want to come back for a 4th. And that's what we're trying to do. And I think that's where Biden and company are, like any number of other leaders on the left, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, who else got us in trouble? Bill Clinton in the Balkans. It seems to me, Judge, that there's a pattern here that's developing. Now, I know for a fact, and I know this is diverting a little bit, but I know that that General McMaster, when he was National Security Advisor to Trump, actually walked in 3 separate times and demanded that Trump authorized troop deployments to Syria. And he was like, no way. And I know for a fact, and I think Doug can confirm this as well, that Trump had the sense to not be bullied into doing something that was not in our interests. And this is where, again, right now, Judge, I don't see where anything we're talking about is in the American interests, the interest of economy, economic growth, being good neighbors. Again, it's like a bullying, like we're trying to get in there and bully someone. And I can tell you right now.
So what do Victoria Nuland and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin want? Do they want to drive Putin from office?
Well, that's what Biden said. He said he wanted him out. I think, look, you remove Putin, you create the potential for shattering a very large number of Russian states. Basically, Russia is made up of a lot of states. Putin has said, I want to put the band back together, and he kind of is. So he's been trying his best to get Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of those stands back kind of under his control, based on the paranoia you and I spoke about. They've always had influence. I don't think there's anything wrong with their influence. It's like, okay, it's not our job to tell them what to have influence or not, especially since they have a tradition of this, to include Crimea. So it's like, okay, why are we involved in that? That's not our job. We're not the world policemen. Right, and so I think that's what it comes down to. But Nuland thinks we should be. They've got
push
their own
Putin out of office. You may end up with the guy who was the president after Putin's 2 terms, and then while he was the president, they changed the constitution so that Putin could serve for as many terms. Dmitry Medvedev. What did he say last week? He said, we may have to push our troops all the way to the Ukraine-Polish border and maybe into Poland.
That's what I mean.
This guy's crazy and makes Putin seem like a middle-of-the-road moderate by comparison.
That's what I'm saying. And then, obviously, if you have a shattered republic in the form of the Soviet Union, imagine like Libya with nukes. Imagine that. Imagine Libya, a failed state like Russia with nukes, and all the different shenanigans that go on. Trust me. I spent a lot of time studying loose nukes. I actually worked with Ambassador Hank Cooper. We worked on a team on this a few years ago. The last thing we want, Judge, are people who are willing to sell multi-megaton weapons on the black market. It's not a good idea. I don't think we want to see that. And that's why I think we have to invest in maintaining Russia, whether we like it or not, as a whole state. It's just not a good idea.
Back to sleepwalking into World War III.
Yeah.
F-16s. Now, why on earth would we be training Ukraine pilots to fly them? Joe Biden has said we're not going to give them. I guess Victoria Nuland is twisting his arm. And if a Ukrainian pilot is flying an F-16, how far can he reach with his offensive weaponry? Moscow?
No. But, Judge, between you and me, we've been friends a long time. When do you really believe anything Joe Biden says anymore? I mean, seriously. I mean, the man lies.
I share that view with you, but
I think he's lying about this
assessment as to how dangerous it would be for us to send them F-16s.
They don't care. Anyway, 2 things on the F-16. F-16 is not the current generation fighter. It's a great aircraft, a great dog fighter. As a matter of fact, it's better than the F-35. We could have a whole discussion of the F-35, the stealth fighter, which gets shot down every time it goes up against one of these aircraft designed in the 80s, just saying. But it's not an offensive capability. These things would not be able to deliver nuclear weapons, not easily. Not to say they couldn't, but it's not designed for that. This is just a Band-Aid. If they do it, Judge, it's just a Band-Aid to give the Ukrainians some ray of hope to keep fighting. That's all it is. F-16s are tactical fighters that would have literally no effect on the battle space. You could give them a dozen of these things. It means nothing. They're short range. They might be able to deliver some precision ordnance on a few places. But I'm telling you right now, the S-300, take it down. There's no way these things would get anywhere past the Ukraine border. Probably not even that into anywhere past that. So I think it's a false hope.
When you were last on, we had some fun running clips from Jack Devine, who Now, I don't know if you worked with him. You worked closely with the CIA. They trained you. You don't share their values, thank God, which is why we're friends. Yes. But Jack, of course, is Full Metal Jacket, CIA. We'll say
he's a corporate man. He's a corporate man.
Correct. Now, here he is on Russia, Gary, that first clip. Nobody knows Afghanistan the way you do, Jack, but that was the death throes of the Soviet Union. That was not Putin with a modern army.
Well, first of all, I dispute he has a modern army. He's now demonstrating to the world he doesn't have a modern army. He has a lot of modern weapons. But
he has a more modern army now than Gorbachev had in the Afghan days.
Yeah, but look at what Afghanis had, AK-47s. Look at what technology has done for the Ukrainians and all the sophisticated technology from drones to cyber intelligence. His army is not showing itself very well. It's a surprise to all of us, although this is the second time I've been surprised, because when I went in to do the Afghan program, I was assured they were 10 feet tall, and then every day they shrunk a quarter of an inch. So I think what's showing here, and I think it's the big story, he has paramilitary functioning as his cutting edge because his own army. Now they're fighting. Remember, Judge, you and I talked about dissent and how the things crumble when you start to lose. Watch the dynamic between the Wagner group and the military.
Colonel Schaefer, do you share this negative, lugubrious assessment of the Russian military?
No, I don't. First, Wagner is the semi-legal organization that can do all the dirty work. And the reason that there's conflict is because the army wants to take credit for what's about to happen, which is going to be basically wearing down and defeating Ukraine. Again, I just go with the numbers. I'm a numbers guy. I was trained as a lieutenant to examine all aspects of the battle space, to include what's behind the front. And there ain't nothing behind the front in Ukraine. There's a lot behind the front in Russia. So I'm just looking at it from a numbers game. So I don't know what school of intelligence analysis Jack went to, but I can tell you, I don't think he went to a good one.
Is Jack wrong when he says that the Russians are using, I don't know, what is a paramilitary force? Cops? I don't know what they are.
It's like Blackwater. I mean, and I just saw.
All right, I know what Wagner is, but so is Jack saying the only reason the Russians are close to taking Bakhmut is because of Wagner? It's not because of Russian military? And does Wagner operate totally outside of the chain of command of Russian military, Tony?
No, well, yes, they are completely separate from the military. They report to Putin directly. It's like Putin's direct access. But we have something similar with JSOC. I'm going to get in trouble for that. Joint Special Operations Command actually reports to the president.
JSOC bypasses the chain of command and bypasses.
No, they actually report directly to the president. Every other regional command has a 4-star general in charge. Okay. JSOC and SOCOM goes directly to the president, our president.
Right, back to Wagner. Wagner reports directly to Putin. The president. Why is Jack calling them paramilitary, or is he referring to somebody else?
No, he's referring to them as paramilitary because essentially they're taking folks and training them like they've got penal battalions. I guess they've taken prisoners and turned them into soldiers. They train them, but they're not considered uniformed soldiers. Apparently, within the Russian system of governance and legal system, they can't have paramilitary organizations, but they do. In this case, it's one that reports to Putin. What I think is going on is Wagner is seen as kind of the special purpose forces. During the Cold War, the Russians had special purpose forces. That is, folks who would go out ahead of normal troops and do special things like assassination, deception, all those things which regular army troops who are less trained, less experienced, just don't do as well. So they're smarter, they're more agile, and they're supposed to be doing things that are more tightly controlled by leadership. That's why they're using Wagner. It has nothing to do with there will be a conflict because I think both sides are going to want credit for, but conflict, not that they're about to be. I think
okay.
About China's exports decreasing in the first few months of this year. So if that country is not making as much money off of other countries, could there be reason for them to increase tensions with those countries that they are not exporting enough items to? There are concerns on the Today Show, at least I saw moving this morning, that China could get involved in Russia's escalation of its war in Ukraine by possibly helping with arms, with arming the Russians in Ukraine. To make sense of all of this, we welcome back to the Rush Christian Leuprecht, professor at the Royal Military College and Queen's University, who will be able to decipher so much more of what is developing right now. Hi, Christian.
Good afternoon, Rashmi.
What do you make of what is happening in China? How would you describe the position the Chinese government's in on the global stage?
I think they're under considerable pressure domestically because the government is not performing on the fundamental social contract that Xi Jinping had laid out a decade ago when he came to power, which is that basically we will take away your rights, but in return, you're going to get prosperity and economic growth. And of course, between the pandemic and corruption that the government has not been able to rein in, and the government's stifling of innovation policy and free markets, that has led to significantly reduced growth, which means the government can't deliver on the sort of promises it has made. And so this has resulted in shifting the legitimation narrative for the Chinese population from economic growth to this populist nationalist type rhetoric. And that has sort of manifest in Taiwan. It is manifest in sort of these external enemies, the United States now being painted as sort of being responsible for all the ills that sort of the Chinese are suffering. Of course, it can't possibly be due to mismanagement and an autocratic authoritarian regime that is fundamentally corrupt to the core. And this is the struggle that the Chinese regime now has, that their only real ally with significant power to try to contest the international order that China and Russia believe is not working in their favor is Russia. But partnering with Russia means that China is going to incur these sanctions from the US, and is going to incur sort of trade restrictions with other U.S. allied and partner countries. And so Xi Jinping, I think, is finding himself in a rather tricky situation, largely of his own making.
Is there an example from history that we can look at to understand what China could do next? I mean, is partnering with Russia a real option?
Yeah, I think the two countries face very different destinations. I mean, Russia had never really been a global superpower until the end of World War II, and it sort of kind of tried to crawl its way into the superpowers, even though it never had the economic or the population heft to do that, and has always held trouble holding together its empire because it's made up of these many different ethnicities and language groups. So Russia has always had this existential challenge, in particular as an empire, whereas China, of course, is a 6,000-year-long empire that prevailed against all sorts of challenges and then collapsed in a matter of a century. And so what Xi Jinping is trying to do is in his view, sort of reestablish the rightful claim of China as a major global power, whereas what Putin is trying to do is struggling to hang on by his fingernails to sort of this Russian claim to somehow be a superpower, when really what it is a developing country with nuclear weapons.
A developing country with nuclear weapons. Yeah. So how would you describe those two countries as threats to the West? Because that's what we're being made to understand, right? Is China as big of a threat to the West as Russia?
So geostrategically, yes, because I think the elites that are coming up in Russia that are one generation younger than the current kleptocracy, they're equally kleptocratic, but they don't have this nostalgia for the Soviet Union and don't want to engage in the Soviet reunion that Putin is dreaming of. They simply want to make money. And so I think with Russia, there's a 20-year prospect of, as the current kleptocracy dies off, we can have more constructive relations, which is why it's important not to alienate the Russian people in our struggle with the Russian regime. At the same time, when it comes to China, China clearly has decades-long ambition for certainly predominance in the Indo-Pacific region, and ultimately, I think, very much a global perspective and global dominance. And so, while I think the Russian challenge may be manageable over the next 2 decades, the challenge with China is going to become more significant. And I think as China finds itself more under pressure domestically, inherently what countries do is start outside conflicts to distract from their internal mismanagement. It's not an accident that Russia started the conflict with Ukraine after it had mismanaged the pandemic and mismanaged its own economy for the last 15 years. And so the challenge here is, as economic growth slows in China, that the Chinese regime will be looking to distract from its own mismanagement by starting this external conflict ostensibly with Taiwan and dragging the West in. So these are challenging developments to watch in China. But one of the, I think with the economic growth, one of the bigger challenges for us is if we have China's concerned about a Russia that might fall apart, given the challenges that Putin has created for himself for the last year, and China itself has this existential angst. And so I think increasingly we're going to see this populist nationalist narrative that we saw from Xi Jinping in the last 24 hours. And that sort of hostility is inherently, I think, not particularly promising for a constructive future of an international community that has significant challenges to solve, whether that's climate change or demographic growth.
That last sentence just gave me goosebumps, Christian. I mean, what are we going into here? I mean, so if China and Russia are increasing aggression, they have targets, they're looking at the West. We've watched Canada with NATO. We've watched the EU. We've watched these countries tiptoe through the last calendar year while Ukrainians have been slaughtered. How does a country like Canada navigate these scenarios with China feeling so vulnerable with its own reduced growth?
Yeah, I think one of the things we clearly need to do is effective deterrence. It's something where we failed with regards to Ukraine, where for 15 years we let Putin get away in all sorts of parts of his neighborhood with effectively gross violations of international law and the established sort of international order. And then all of a sudden, Putin would have expected that he would get away with invading Ukraine. So we set the wrong precedent. And so I think what we need to do with China is set a clear line in terms of deterrence. The problem is the only country in the Indo-Pacific that can effectively deter China is the United States. So if the United States needs to be focused on China and on containing China, that means that countries, especially such as Canada, need to provide some relief for the United States in Europe in terms of containing Russia. And that means that Canada needs to have all hands on deck when it comes to supporting our European allies and our European partners, both in terms of the war in Ukraine and in terms of deterring broader Russian aggression and bullying in the region. And of course, as we've seen, Canada has been wholly unprepared due to 20 years of essentially benign neglect of our foreign policy and of our armed forces. And so I think the problem is that nobody in Canada is ever playing ahead. And I think we'll find ourselves relegated broadly to irrelevance, especially by the United States, but also by our European allies, if we don't have a bit of foresight and we can show that we're actually relevant to defending the status quo and especially our European allies.
Christian Leuprecht, big, broad questions, clear, concise answers. We appreciate your insights all the time. Thank you so much. Christian Leuprecht is the professor at the Royal Military College and Queen's University, breaking down